So in our last episode, we found our 914 unable to start and needing a new fuel pump. And I talked about how I'm going to be relocating it. It's already relocated to the front, but I'm going to be moving it to a different location. And we also talked about what I'm doing with regards to I'm putting in a fuel pump that is a fuel injection fuel pump, even though I'm running carburetors. And I talked about the reasons of why I'm doing that. If you didn't see the previous video, I'd suggest watching that and then coming back to this one. And on this video, we're going to be going over the actual install and the performance test of it afterwards. If you like this sort of content, if you like Porsche 914 content, please like and subscribe. That helps us gauge interest. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is so I want to make sure that when I install this unit here, since it is a high flow, high pressure unit, and I'm going to be putting in a regulator that brings it down to a low pressure and it bypasses to return. But I want to make sure that this setup works before I go and install this and be ending up with a high pressure fuel pump with carbs and it just doesn't work. So I want to make sure, I'm just going to do a quick mock-up to make sure that this is going to work, that I can adjust this, that we can get pressures that I'm looking for, and so on. Okay, so this is our fuel pressure regulator. We have it set up now. So basically you're going to have an input side from the fuel tank, and then this side will be the going to your carburetors for fuel injection, and this will be the return side, and then these two are just plugged off. And then when you adjust it is this thing right here, and that increases or decreases the tension on the spring, and so it will create a either raise or lower the pressure that's in here. So that's that. So here on my workbench, I have set up basically a mock-up of the fuel system in the car, so I can test out this little guy here to make sure it's going to work the way I want it to. And so basically I've got my fuel tank here. I've got my supply fuel line. Sorry. Supply fuel line here. Go into my filter. Go into my fuel pump. And then this part would represent the chassis of the body going back to the engine compartment. I've got a fuel pressure gauge hooked up, and then I've got my regulator, and then I've got the return line coming back, and then I've got the what would be the supply line to either the carbs or the fuel injection system. And what I have to do to simulate that is I have to basically clamp it, and then that gives me the pressure that I need, because that either simulates, like the float is full on the carbs, or the fuel injection system where everything is under pressure. So when I do that, I can then turn on my pump and as you can see here, we've got some fuel pressure. If I dial this in, I can get more. I've got it up to 10 psi right now. But what I'm interested in is whether we can go down to like 3 psi. That's probably about right there, maybe a little less. So we will probably have to isolate the sound on that guy. He's a little loud, but as you can see, you can make him quieter. But that's how it's working, and that's how you can adjust the fuel pressure. So basically turning this in drives the spring down, increases the pressure in the unit, and so that's how you increase your fuel pressure. Again, the reason I set this up is because I've got carburetors in this car right now. I don't want to flood the system. I want it to have the necessary, what it's supposed to have, like 3 psi. But I want to go ahead and install my fuel injection pump, because eventually that car is going to fuel injection. And I'd like to, since I've got to install a fuel pump, I want to do it now, just get it done. And then I'll have this nice thing here that I can use to adjust the fuel pressure. And if I want to run fuel injection, then I will come and take this spring and put that in there, and that way I can drive this up to 30 psi. Right now with the thinner spring, it's going to only go up to 20 psi, so 3 to 20 psi. Now, of course, this setup isn't perfect. Obviously, when it's actually in the car, this line is longer. There'll be more losses. But this gives me a rough idea that yes, this is going to work. So that's where we're at. And so when we look at the installation instructions for the fuel pressure regulator, one thing that they do show you is a chart here, and they caution you about says the bypass regulator must have a return line installed, and it must be routed from the bottom return port of the regulator and routed back to the top of the fuel cell. Failure to install a return line that is at least as big or bigger than the recommended in the chart will result in uncontrolled high pressure and potential flooding of the carbureted engines. So if we look at where our fuel pump is, it's in the 1 to 60 GPH range, and the return line length is basically somewhere around there. So they're showing for all of those ranges basically a 3/8 inch return line. That's a problem because our return line is not 3/8 of an inch. So what I suspect is going on here is that this chart is so what they're basically telling you is that if you have too much restriction in this return path, then they can't really guarantee that they're going to be able to deliver this this fuel pressure. You might have to have higher fuel pressure than what you need or want for those carburetors in order to overcome the restrictions in the return path, and then that higher pressure is going to flood your engine. So looking at this, I'm still a little cautious here that we might not be able to use this sort of setup here. I mean, of course, this chart, it doesn't lend you much. I mean, basically everything is all, there's nothing smaller than 3/8, but unfortunately, if you look at the the gas tank and the fuel line return line size is it is smaller than 3/8. So how's that all going to play out? It's sort of a gamble here. It's sort of we'll have to see if this does work out. Are the losses in the line negligible enough that we can still crank down and get our PSI where we want it, and also, you know, be able to drive this fluid back to the tank, etc. So we'll have to see how that works out. That's why that's one of the reasons I set this sort of thing up, but there's still a little bit of an unknown here. So when I'm installing it on this car, I kind of know that going in that maybe this won't work, and maybe we'll have to come up with another plan. But we're this far in, and I kind of suspected that when I ordered this, that maybe just because I'm at the lower end of the range, so I was thinking, you know, I like to be in the middle of any range whenever I have a spring adjustment. So I'm at the lower end, maybe 3.5 is sort of where I need to be. So we don't know exactly if it's going to work. Hopefully it will, but we're just going to give it a shot and see what happens.
So one might think that if you take a high pressure fuel pump and regulate it down to very low pressure, like 3 psi, that you're doing damage to the pump. It's actually the opposite. This style of regulator is called a bypass regulator, and basically what that means is the lower you set the pressure on it, the more flow goes into bypass. So this chart here represents a typical fuel pump chart, showing on the left axis you have the pressure, and on the bottom axis is the flow. So basically, if you operate the pump with a lot of restriction in the line, then the pump's going to produce a lot of pressure. But if you operate the pump in a system that has very little restriction, then you're going to not develop a lot of pressure, but you'll get more flow. So you may have noticed when I was lowering the pressure on the regulator, the noise on the fuel pump got louder, and that's because it was speeding up. Basically, there was less, the pump just had to work less, and so it's running faster, pumping more fluid out.
Removing the, we're going to remove our pan here, so we can get access to the bottom of the gas tank, and then drain the gas tank. Okay, so this is what we got here. I can see I've got a fuel filter down here already. I've got, and kind of a tight little bend there, but it has been flowing, so yeah. So again, the reason I set it up this way, I have the fuel filter here, so I was thinking that this would be you know, a good way to access it here, to replace it, but did not think that I would need to so quickly be replacing the fuel pump. So the only thing that's really easily accessible in this situation right now is just the filter. Would like to have the fuel pump here as well, but as you can see, there's just not a lot of room here for that. And so we're just going to let it drain out for a little while here. So now the next thing that you would normally have to do is come up here and remove the return line. So we've got the supply line disconnected from the gas tank, but the return line is still connected. But on this car, because it is carbureted, we don't have that return line, and so that's been already plugged up. So that's going to make it easier for us to get this tank out. We don't have to disconnect it. So now we can go up top and continue on. So anytime you remove a fuel tank on one of these 914s, you seem to always end up scratching the underside of the hood. So what you have to do, what I'm going to do this time, I went ahead and I roped up my hood so that it is open at maximum possible side, because I've already went through the effort to paint the underside of my hood and so on. So we've got it held up like that, and then we're also going to take other precautions, but that's one of them. So to remove the fuel tank, there's a little line here we have to disconnect. It's pretty hard on there. Got that one off. And then we're going to have to disconnect our little charcoal canister, which I've already got that out of the way. And then really it is just a matter of getting this little strap right here removed and opened up, and then from there the whole fuel tank can rise out of there. So now with the strap out of the way, you can see the tank. You can now just lift it out. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go get one of my sons to help me with this, because I don't want to scratch the hood.
And once again, I forgot to remove the electrical connection before lifting the tank. And so, yeah, you won't be able to move the tank up only a few inches unless you disconnect this first.
Okay, we got the tank out without harming anything, and we did use an old comforter on top of it just to make sure that we didn't scratch it up. And we got it out with no scratches. And so now we're looking in here, and there we see a little fuel pump that I put in there that died, and that's what we're trying to get at, to get it out of there. So on the 75 and 76 914s, you had a little door here, and that is where they relocated the fuel pump. So it works good there. I don't have the door there, so not really keen on putting a door in there either. So we're gonna see what else we can work out. So when we look down here as to where we can install it, we are so limited down here. We have our rack and pinion system, so these things move a little bit, so we want to keep clear of that. So probably what's going to end up happening is going to be like something like right here, and it's just always so very limited room to work with down here.
So the aftermarket fuel pumps, sometimes they can be loud and louder than the factory pumps. So that was a concern. So when I decided, what I decided to do was mount this pump on the suspension cross member, but I wanted some isolation between the member and the pump. So I had some soundproofing, and I just used it as a wrap to provide a little bit of layer of isolation between the frame and the pump.
So I have my fuel pump mounted under here and surrounded with the soundproofing wrap, and I've hooked up fuel lines to it, to my tank, and I've got my battery here, and I want to make sure that this thing isn't going to be too loud, and so this gives me a little opportunity to play with it a little bit. And so we're going to turn it on, and so that's the noise that it makes while on. And so that's us in the car. That's a little bit of noise, but that's to be expected. It's not too loud, I don't think, but we can you can see how it goes in real life, but that doesn't seem too bad.
One of the most important things about relocating the fuel pump down below there is doing it in such a way that you don't have any kinks in the fuel lines. So that takes a little bit of planning and positioning of the orientation of the fuel lines that come out of the tank, and then finally making sure that everything, when the wheels are turning, when the suspension is moving and the wheels are turning, the steering wheel is turning, just making sure that everything is moving freely without interfering with the fuel lines, and overall that there's no kinks, no sharp turns, that the fuel line may harden later, that it turns into a kink.
Start it again.
So here is how I mounted the fuel pressure regulator in the engine bay. I specifically did not want to drill any holes and mount it to the body. So I found a way to do that just by mounting it to the base of one of the carburetors. And so you see it here, the way I've connected it, and it also I'm having right now a temporary fuel pressure gauge, so I can dial it in at about 3 to 3.5 psi. So with the fuel pump installed and with the new regulator installed, then it was time to take it out and see how it does on the open road. So for a first test drive, everything seems to work very well. Doesn't seem to be any fuel delivery issues. There's no excessive noise from the fuel pump. So for a more thorough test of the work that we did on the car, we decided to take the cars out for a little joyride in the Texas Hill Country on a Sunday afternoon. So that's my son there in his 1987 924S. That is the little car we had picked up in a non-running state and rejuvenated it, so it is now on the road again. Do have some noise coming from what appears to be the transmission. So the fuel pump and regulator seem to be working very well. I've identified a few things that I need to do on the car. So that will wrap up this episode on my 914 with the fuel pump and getting it running again. If you like this video and want to see more 914 content, please just like and subscribe, and that will help us gauge interest. Until next time, juice.